Take a look at this photograph. This is the last known picture of 9 experienced hikers who set out on what was supposed to be a routine winter expedition in Russia's Ural Mountains. But what happened to them on the night of February 1, 1959, remains one of the most baffling mysteries in mountaineering history. Their tent was found ripped open from the inside, and the group had fled into the freezing wilderness wearing almost nothing. Some bodies would be found with injuries so severe that investigators couldn't explain how they occurred. And yes, this is the disturbing story of the Dyatlov Pass Incident. In January 1959, 10 students and graduates from the Ural Polytechnic Institute gathered in Sverdlovsk to embark on a challenging winter hiking expedition. The goal was to reach Mount Otterton in the northern Urals, and the journey would cover over 200 miles through some of Russia's most unforgiving winter terrain. The group was led by 23-year-old Igor Dyatlov, an experienced mountaineer who had organized multiple expeditions before and was a fifth-year engineering student. The expedition was classified as Category 3, the most difficult rating at the time, which meant that upon successful completion, all participants would receive certification to lead similar expeditions in the future. On January 23rd, the group departed by train and then by truck to reach Vizhai, the last inhabited settlement. From there, they would continue on skis into the wilderness. The first few days passed without incident, despite challenging weather conditions. They documented their journey with photographs and diary entries showing the team was in good spirits. However, on January 27th, Yuri Yudin was forced to turn back due to severe joint pain. It was a decision that would save his life. The remaining 9 continued on, and Yudin would be the last person to see them alive. By January 31st, the group had reached the highland area and was preparing to climb Otterton. According to Igor's plan, they were supposed to send a telegram to their sports club by February 12th. The weather was deteriorating, with heavy snow and wind slowing their progress. On February 1st, the group began climbing the mountain pass, but worsening conditions forced them to make camp earlier than planned. And this is where things take a strange turn. Instead of descending to the forest below, where they could find shelter from the wind and access firewood, the group pitched their tent on the exposed slope of a mountain known as Koletsiakal, which means Dead Mountain in the local Mansi language. This was an unusual decision for experienced mountaineers. The slope was exposed, windy, and offered no natural protection. But they set up their tent there anyway, and as darkness fell, the temperature dropped to approximately -25 to -30 degrees Celsius. So why do you think they pitched their tent on the exposed mountain slope instead of a sheltered forested area? I guess that's a question that will remain unanswered forever. When the group didn't send a telegram by February 12th, their families began to worry. But as days passed with no word, panic set in. On February 20th, a search team was organized. After 6 days of searching, on February 26th, they reached the abandoned campsite on the slope of Koletsiakal. What they found was deeply disturbing. The tent was still standing, but it had been ripped open from the inside, not by an animal or external force, but deliberately cut by someone inside trying to get out. Inside, investigators found most of the group's belongings, including boots, warm clothing, and supplies. Everything indicated they had left in absolute panic. But what makes it even stranger is this. The tent had been carefully set up and secured. Food had been prepared for a meal. Personal items were arranged as if the group was settling in for the night. There were no signs of a struggle, no indication of an animal attack, and no evidence of an avalanche. It was as if something had forced them to evacuate immediately, without even taking a few seconds to grab their boots. Footprints in the snow led away from the tent, heading down the slope toward the forest. The tracks had been made by people who were either barefoot or wearing only socks. Some were even outside in their underwear. The footprints could be seen for several hundred meters before disappearing under fresh snow. About a mile down the slope, at the edge of the forest, investigators found the remains of a small fire under a large cedar tree. Next to the fire, they discovered the first two bodies, Yuri Doroshenko and Yuri Krivonishenko. Both were found wearing only their underwear. The skin on their hands and fingers was badly damaged, with scratches and burn marks. The branches of the cedar tree above them were broken up to a height of 15 feet, suggesting that someone may have climbed the tree, perhaps to look back at the tent up the slope or to search for a way out. These two young men had apparently tried to light a fire to stay warm, but without proper clothing in such extreme cold, their efforts were in vain. The fire had gone out, and they had frozen to death. But the mystery deepened. Why had they climbed the tree? What were they looking at? Or what were they hiding from? 3 more bodies were found between the cedar tree and the tent. First, Igor Dyatlov was found, positioned as if he was trying to climb the slope back toward the tent. Then, about 330 meters higher up, they found Zenaida Kolmogorova, who was also trying to return to the tent. Rustem Slobodin was discovered between the two. All 3 were more clothed than the 2 Yuris, but still inadequately dressed for the conditions. Medical examinations would later reveal that all 3 had died from hypothermia, but Rustem had a fractured skull. But the most disturbing discoveries were yet to come. 4 members were still missing. Search efforts continued until May, when the snow finally began to melt. On May 4th, the remaining 4 bodies were found in a ravine about 250 meters from the cedar tree, buried under 13 feet of snow. They had apparently tried to dig into the snow to create a shelter, and they were found somewhat better dressed. Some clothing had been cut from the bodies of their deceased friends. But what shocked the investigators was the condition of these bodies. Unlike the first 5, these 4 had suffered massive internal trauma. Ludmila Dubinina was missing her tongue, eyes, and part of her facial tissue. She had fractured ribs. Her ribs were broken so severely that a forensic expert compared the force required to a high-speed car crash. Nicholas Thibault Brignol had severe skull damage. Alexander Zolotaryov had similar chest injuries. But remarkably, none of them had external wounds. Their skin was intact. No cuts, no bruises, no signs of a struggle or attack. The medical examiner determined that the injuries were caused by an unknown compelling force and that the amount of pressure required was beyond what a human could apply. Yet there was no evidence of a vehicle, no rockfall, no avalanche debris. Just these devastating internal injuries with no apparent external cause. The official investigation concluded in May 1959 with a frustratingly vague explanation. The cause of death was determined to be a compelling natural force that the mountaineers could not overcome. The case was then closed and the records were sealed. The area was closed to hikers for 3 years after the incident. So what really happened on that mountain? Over the years, theories have ranged from plausible to bizarre. Some suggested an avalanche, but there was no evidence. Others proposed infrasound, low-frequency sound waves created by wind that can cause panic in people. There were theories involving military testing, as one of the victims had worked at a nuclear plant, and some clothing reportedly showed traces of radiation. Perhaps the most unsettling detail is what the sole survivor, Yuri Yudin, said in later interviews. He mentioned that as the group approached the mountain, some members seemed uneasy. And when he saw the photograph of their final campsite, he noted that the way they set up the tent didn't make sense for experienced mountaineers. In 2019, 60 years after the tragedy, Russian authorities reopened the case. They concluded that the most likely cause was an avalanche, despite this contradicting much of the physical evidence. Many experts and victims' families rejected this conclusion. The Dyatlov Pass Incident remains one of the greatest unsolved mysteries in outdoor adventure history. 9 experienced mountaineers died under conditions that defy logical explanation. Their tent was cut from the inside. They fled into deadly cold without proper clothing. Some suffered injuries that forensic experts compared to car crashes, yet there was no external trauma. And to this day, no one can say with certainty what happened on Dead Mountain that night in 1959. If you've made it this far, thank you so much for watching. If you have any theories about what might have happened, feel free to share them in the comments. If you have any real events in mind that you'd like me to cover, you can write them in the comments.